A millionaire, owner of a factory, made a simple worker the boss. Everyone laughed, until she made them silent. The morning it all began, her toast had burned black. She hadn't meant to fall asleep on the kitchen chair, but the shift last night had gone long, and her feet still ached as though the concrete floors of the assembly line had fused with her bones. Yulia scraped the charred edges off with a butter knife, brushed breadcrumbs off her overalls, and tied her hair in a tight bun that would pass inspection. She was 25, with the kind of tiredness that settled into the eyes and rarely left. Her co-workers at the textile factory called her Mouse, not out of cruelty, but because she hardly spoke and always seemed to shrink away from the chaos. No one respected her. She knew it. They didn't mock her outright, but they never included her in their jokes, their gossip, their cigarette breaks. When the machines broke down, no one asked if she was okay lifting crates. When the supervisor barked insults, they laughed, grateful it wasn't directed at them. But Yulia endured it all with a steady quiet. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to pay rent, to buy medicine for her mother, and to make sure the electricity stayed on at home. That morning, though, everything shifted. It was a delivery day, the floor buzzing with forklifts and shouting. The kind of day where accidents happened, where a single distraction could cost a hand or worse. Yulia moved quickly, sorting finished bolts of fabric when a crash rang out near the storage shelves. A pallet had tilted, heavy rolls of velvet tumbling like boulders. People shouted. Someone screamed. She moved before thinking, yanking a younger worker, Alexei, out of harm's way just before one of the rolls crashed where he'd stood. The impact cracked the concrete, dust rising like smoke. Alexei stared at her, stunned. "You okay?" Yulia asked, breathless. He nodded, speechless. She turned back to her work, her hands only beginning to shake. Unbeknownst to her, someone had been watching. Upstairs, in an office no one ever visited, Daniel Varanin looked away from the floor-to-ceiling window where he'd just seen the entire scene unfold. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not exactly. The factory was one of 20 holdings in his family's textile empire, inherited after a father who died too early and a brother who wanted only the yacht and Paris apartment. Daniel wasn't like them. He believed in walking the ground, in knowing the people who made his wealth possible. He'd been in the region quietly, posing as a consultant reviewing operations. No one knew he was the owner. That anonymity gave him clarity. But what he saw that morning shook him. Yulia hadn't looked around for applause. She hadn't even waited for thanks. She'd moved with instinct, with focus. And then returned to her work like it didn't matter. He asked the floor manager about her. "HM? Yulia? Been here 5 years. Doesn't talk much. Works like a mule. Bit strange, to be honest." Strange. That word lingered in Daniel's thoughts. The next morning, he called in his deputy and quietly requested something unprecedented. "Make her floor supervisor. Effective immediately." "Sir? With respect, she's just—" "Do it," he said. When the announcement was made, no one clapped. Yulia stood frozen as her name was called out at the daily briefing. She thought it was a mistake. "A what?" she whispered to the floor manager. "You're the new floor supervisor," he said without warmth. "Effective today." Orders came from upstairs. Alexei was the first to speak. "She saved me," he said softly. "Yesterday." That seemed to shift the room. People looked at her differently. Not kindly, yet, but with a new wariness. A new curiosity. The girl they'd ignored was now in charge of them. And Yulia, who had never been respected, now had the weight of authority without warning, without preparation, and without a clue why it had happened. She didn't know that the man watching from the upper floor window was already wondering how a woman like her could survive so long unnoticed, and why, since noticing her, he couldn't stop. The office they gave her smelled of dust and old varnish. It had no windows, just a chipped desk, a computer that whirred like it had asthma, and a corkboard with thumbtacks still clinging to someone else's outdated charts. It didn't matter to Yulia. She wasn't there for the aesthetics. The promotion arrived with a title and a lanyard badge that read, Supervisor. But little else. No training. No support. No explanation. She kept thinking it had been a mistake, until her first meeting with the man they called Victor, a regional operations officer who never looked directly at her. He had the habit of speaking while checking his watch. Don't make trouble, he told her. Keep the quotas steady, don't fraternize with the workers, and stay out of HR's way. You're a placeholder until we bring someone proper in. Someone proper. Yulia nodded, even as something twisted inside her. The workers, meanwhile, didn't know what to make of her. Those who had once rolled their eyes when she passed now avoided eye contact. Others suddenly offered tight, polite greetings. Alexei stopped bringing his breakfast to the break room. It was as if the air around her had changed, heavy with suspicion and careful calculation. Still, Yulia did what she always did. She worked. She studied every production log, memorized the supply chains, stayed late after shifts recalibrating workflow charts. She spotted inefficiencies no one else had bothered fixing. And when the older machine on row 3 jammed again, she didn't call maintenance. She rolled up her sleeves, dug through the grease and lint herself, and got it running. That night, in a far different office lined with brushed steel and quiet elegance, Daniel Varanin reviewed the daily reports with a subtle satisfaction. Row 3 output increased by 8%. His deputy noted. And absenteeism has dropped on Yulia's floor. Interesting, Daniel said. Any complaints? Not a single one. They're curious, though. About her. About you. Good. He stood and moved toward the window. Let them wonder. May I ask, sir, why her? Daniel didn't answer right away. His eyes traced the edge of the factory's roof below, the same building his father had walked decades ago in a wool overcoat and stubborn pride. She doesn't play games, he said finally. She doesn't waste energy on pretense. People like that, they either vanish, or they rise. I wanted to see which one she would do. 2 weeks into her new role, Yulia received a call summoning her upstairs. She was sure it was a mistake. No one from the lower floors was called up, unless they'd been caught stealing. The elevator ride felt like a trip to another world. The buttons gleamed, and the carpet didn't smell like oil. A woman in a blazer greeted her with a soft, "This way," and led her into a corner office filled with quiet music and filtered light. Daniel Varanin stood by a shelf of fabric samples, inspecting a swatch of indigo linen. You're Yulia, he said, not turning. Yes, she replied, unsure of where to look. I've heard you're efficient. That you fix machines yourself, don't take breaks, and haven't used your vacation days in 5 years. She didn't know whether it was a compliment or an accusation. He turned to face her then. No suit, just a black shirt and sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked younger than she expected, and more tired. Why did you take the job? He asked. I wasn't given a choice, she said plainly. Something flickered in his eyes. No ambition? Ambition is expensive, she said. And it doesn't always pay. He smiled at that. A small, surprised smile. You don't recognize me, do you? She blinked. Should I? He gestured toward the window. I own this place. The silence between them was complete. When she spoke, it was with quiet certainty. I thought owners didn't notice people like me. I didn't. Not until I did. They stared at each other a moment too long. Then he handed her a folder. New Supply Chain Initiative. I want your feedback. Real feedback. Not the kind filtered through 5 layers of yes men. Yulia took the folder with steady hands. Why me? He shrugged, already turning away. You're the only one who hasn't asked me for anything. As she left the office, the hallway lights humming above her, Yulia realized something unexpected. She didn't want to vanish anymore. Not if it meant being seen like that. She was not prepared for what followed. In the days after her meeting with Daniel Varanin, the atmosphere in the factory shifted in subtle but undeniable ways. Word got around, though no one said it directly, that she had spoken with someone important upstairs. Rumors blossomed in the absence of facts. Some said she was related to the owner. Others whispered she was sleeping with him. A few claimed she was an undercover auditor, planted to expose inefficiency. Yulia ignored them all. She focused instead on the supply chain files he had handed her. They were messy, overcomplicated, riddled with middlemen and logistics companies skimming margins. She stayed late again, running numbers, drafting streamlined alternatives. And for reasons she couldn't explain even to herself, she included a short note with her analysis. Not just data, observations. You trust too many people who haven't set foot in a factory in years. Some of these vendors charge for delays they themselves cause. People rely on your name to get away with it. She didn't sign it with anything more than her initials. Daniel read her report at midnight, in a glass-walled suite 10 stories above the sleeping city. He had expected basic suggestions, maybe a few line-item adjustments. He hadn't expected this clarity. This honesty. He stared at the note again, a strange tightness building in his chest. Most people tried to flatter him. Most tried to impress. Yulia just told the truth. He called his deputy the next morning. Cut Ivanov freight. Reassigned to JNO Logistics. Piloted on the textile plant's next shipment. But they're friends of the board. They've been skimming from my company, Daniel said flatly. I don't care who they golf with. Back at the factory, Yulia noticed something else changing. Respect. It started small, someone letting her pass first in the hallway, someone else offering her half a sandwich during the break. Alexei began calling her boss in a way that no longer sounded like a joke. Even the floor manager, who had once refused to meet her gaze, now mumbled, "Morning, supervisor," when she walked in. She wasn't sure what to do with any of it. Power, she realized, made people rearrange themselves around you, even if you never asked them to. Still, it was the second call from upstairs that caught her most off guard. Mr. Varanin would like your opinion on a new raw material partnership. Can you join him this evening at the central warehouse? She stared at her phone for a moment before replying. Yes. The warehouse was mostly dark when she arrived, the security lights casting long shadows across the crates. She found him near the loading dock, in jeans and a winter coat, flipping through supplier samples. You came, he said, as though he wasn't sure she would. You asked? I did. He handed her a folder. I want to move sourcing to a local supplier in Vologda. Better quality, but slightly higher cost. What do you think? She thumbed through the documents, brow furrowed. The quality's better, she said. But this isn't about cost. He looked at her. No? She nodded toward the fine print. This is about loyalty. You're choosing a supplier you trust over one who gives discounts. You're betting long term. Most companies don't. Daniel said nothing for a moment. Then, I like the way you see things. She looked at him carefully, unsure of what he meant. Then, in a voice quieter than before, he asked, Has it been difficult? Being in charge so suddenly? Yes, she said without hesitation. They're waiting for me to make a mistake. Then don't. It's not that simple. It is, he said. Be better than they expect. Every day. The silence stretched between them. I used to think no one saw me, she said finally. I do, he replied, eyes fixed on hers. She should have stepped back. Should have left then. But instead she asked, Why are you really here? In this city? In this factory? He hesitated. I wanted to see what my company really was. What I really was. And? I wasn't ready for the answer. Their eyes held for a moment too long. Something unsaid hovered between them, tentative, unformed, but undeniable. Then she turned. Thank you for the opportunity, she said quietly, and walked out into the cold. Yulia tried to carry on as though nothing had changed. As though that evening in the warehouse had been just another conversation about supply chains and logistics. As though she hadn't noticed the way Daniel's voice had softened, or how his eyes had stayed on her a moment too long when he said, I do. But something had shifted. Not overtly, not in any way that could be named or cited, but it was there. In the way the guards greeted her at the factory gates now. In the unscheduled coffee deliveries to her office. In the late-night emails signed not with D.V. or Varanen, but simply Daniel. Still, he never crossed the line. Never touched her, never made a suggestion, never gave her any special treatment that could be traced or proven. It was worse than that. He respected her. And somehow, that made it more dangerous. A month passed. Yulia's team hit record output for the quarter. Defects were down. Turnover slowed. Even the most cynical among the workers grudgingly admitted she knew what she was doing. No one dared say it out loud, but people started to believe she might actually stay in the role. And then the invitation arrived. A formal envelope, delivered by hand. Embossed with the Varanen Group's seal. She turned it over 3 times before opening it. An evening in honor of Operations Excellence. Hosted by Daniel Varanen. Thursday, 7 p.m. The Atrium Room, Grand Hotel Aragon. Formal dress. No guests. She stared at the line that said formal dress like it was written in a foreign language. What did she even own that could pass? 3 days later, she stood in a borrowed dress in front of her apartment mirror. It belonged to her neighbor, Dasha, who had insisted on lending it. Simple black, tastefully cut, with sleeves just long enough to hide the small scars on her arms from years at the machines. She pinned her hair up with shaking hands. At the venue, chandeliers bathed the room in golden light. Men in dark suits stood in clusters, talking in low voices. Women in silk and satin laughed too loudly. No one noticed Yulia arrive. Except him. He was standing by a marble column, half listening to a conversation. The moment he saw her, he excused himself and crossed the room without hesitation. "You came," he said. "You asked?" He offered his arm, and hesitantly, she took it. People stared. Some recognized her. Most didn't. She could feel the judgment in their eyes. The assumptions. He leaned in slightly. "They'll think whatever they want. Let them." She looked at him. "Are we giving them a reason to think anything?" His voice was steady. "Not yet." Later, during the speeches, he singled her out. "In every factory, every office, every floor, there is someone whose work keeps things running unnoticed. Sometimes, the best leaders are the ones no one saw coming." He turned then, looked directly at her. "I'd like to thank Yulia Morozova for showing us what strength without arrogance, and leadership without noise can look like." She froze. Then the applause started, scattered at first, then gathering strength. A few stood. Not many. But enough. And for the first time in her life, Yulia felt what it meant to be truly seen, and not merely watched. Afterward, he found her alone on a balcony. "I meant every word," he said quietly. She looked at the city below. "Why me, Daniel?" He exhaled. "Because you remind me what this company was supposed to be. What I was supposed to be." She turned to him. Her voice was calm, but firm. "You can't fall in love with someone because they make you feel better about yourself." A pause. Then, almost a whisper. "What if it's not that?" She didn't answer. Didn't trust herself to. Instead, she stepped away. "Good night, Mr. Varanen," and left him standing alone in the cold. Monday morning returned like nothing had happened. The machines clanked, the loading bays roared, and the workers slipped back into their routines. Yulia wore her uniform and plain expression like armor. No one mentioned the gala, though she caught Alexei staring once, then quickly looking away. Only the HR assistant, Anya, dared break the silence. "You looked different," she said quietly over the printer. "At the event. Powerful." Yulia didn't know what to say to that. She hadn't felt powerful. She had felt exposed. She avoided Daniel. For nearly 2 weeks, she ignored the emails that bore his name, always polite, never personal. She had the data, the updates, the schedules. She responded through intermediaries. But she didn't see him. Didn't speak to him. She couldn't. Not because she didn't want to. but because she did. And that terrified her. Then the summons came. This time, it was a dinner meeting. At a quiet restaurant tucked away on the outskirts of the city. A table for two. No name tags, no assistants. She arrived late. Deliberately. He stood when she approached, but said nothing about the time. The waiter brought wine, which she declined. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I'm only here because your assistant said it was urgent." "It is," Daniel replied. "I'm stepping away from daily operations for a while. Taking on a project abroad." She said nothing. The wineglass in front of her remained untouched. "I wanted to tell you in person," he added, "and to ask if you'd consider something." She met his eyes slowly. "What?" "I want you to take over as general manager of this plant." The words landed like a slap. "I'm not qualified." "You're more qualified than anyone else I've seen in that building." She shook her head. "This is because of what happened between us." "Or what didn't happen?" "No," he said. "It's because you're the only person who sees the whole picture. The work. The people. The long game." She sat back, stunned. "You really think that little of me?" he asked softly. "That I'd hand over one of our highest performing plants just to seduce you?" Her face flushed. "I don't know what to think. I didn't offer you dinner. I offered you command." They sat in silence for a long while. Finally she spoke. "Even if I accept, I can't be with you." "I know. I still care." "I know that too." She pushed the untouched wine aside. "This isn't a story where the factory girl marries the millionaire." He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Maybe not. But it might be the one where she outruns him. And he lets her." The next day, Yulia walked the factory floor with a new badge clipped to her chest, General Manager. Her office was bigger now. There were more people to manage, more decisions to make. But when she passed the workers, they nodded. They listened. And for the first time, they followed. Daniel left the city 3 days later. She didn't say goodbye. But he left her a note. "Yulia, you don't need me to build something great. You never did. But I'll be watching from afar, hoping you let me back in, if not into your heart, then at least into the story. D." She folded the note and locked it in her drawer. She had work to do. The first few weeks without him were strangely quiet. Daniel Varanin's absence was not loudly announced. There were no press releases, no formal memos. Just an email from his office stating he'd be overseeing international expansion initiatives, and that regional operations would continue under delegated authority. Yulia read it once, then archived it without comment. She no longer needed instructions from above. She was above. The transition to general manager was not without cost. Former supervisors, some of whom had trained her years ago, now reported to her. A few resisted quietly, undermining decisions with feigned incompetence or subtle obstruction. Others simply waited for her to fail. She didn't. She implemented new shift rotations to reduce burnout. Installed quiet corners near the break rooms for rest. Instituted a policy allowing workers to submit anonymous improvement suggestions. Within a month, absenteeism dropped another 6%. Output held steady. But the victories felt muted. Every morning, she entered her new office and saw the empty guest chair he had once occupied. She'd never say it aloud, but sometimes she imagined him sitting across from her, sleeves rolled, half smiling, asking, "What's the biggest fire today?" And she would have told him. One evening, weeks into her new role, a package arrived. No return address. But the handwriting on the envelope inside was unmistakable. "Thought you might want this." Inside was a bound portfolio. Her supply chain report from months ago, the first one she had submitted to him, filled with blunt notes and sharp observations. It had been annotated. By him. In blue ink, her margins now carry phrases like, "She caught this before my VPs did," and "We should standardize this approach globally." And one final line, scrawled across the last page, Your instincts are sharper than my advisors. Never doubt them. She closed the folder slowly. No flowers. No jewelry. Just validation. The kind she never asked for but had quietly wanted all her life. She didn't respond. Not yet. Then came the investors. A trio from Moscow arrived unannounced one Friday, suits too sharp, smiles too smooth. They asked to tour the factory, review financials, speak with Yulia. She granted the tour. Denied access to payroll. And insisted that any interviews with staff go through HR. You run a tight ship, one said afterward. She nodded. We build ships here. Not stories. The men chuckled. But when they left, she called the regional legal counsel and requested a background check on the group. It wasn't paranoia. It was preparation. The old Yulia would have kept her head down. This one made sure the head that rose wasn't easy to cut off. Her evenings were lonelier now. She didn't date. Didn't go out much. She went home to a tidy apartment, warmed up leftovers, and sometimes read over contracts with music playing softly in the background. Sometimes, though, she wrote. Not to him. But about him. She kept a notebook in her bedside drawer. Pages filled with unsent letters. I saw someone today who laughed the way you did when you're uncomfortable. That almost laugh. The kind that hides more than it reveals. Or, it's snowing here again. You always said the snow made the factory look cleaner than it was. I wonder if you were ever trying to make yourself believe it. She didn't know if she'd ever send any of it. But writing was like breathing, necessary, silent, and private. Then, on a Sunday afternoon, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But she answered. Yulia Morozova? A male voice asked. Unfamiliar. Formal. Yes. This is Alexei Demidov, assistant to Mr. Varanin. He asked me to inform you he'll be back in the country next week. He'd like to visit the factory, informally. She didn't answer. Is that a problem? Demidov asked after a beat. No, she said. Tell him I'll arrange a visitor's pass. And would you prefer he announce the visit publicly or? He can decide that, she said, then hung up. She sat on her couch, phone still in hand, heart pounding harder than she expected. He was coming back. When the day came, she didn't dress differently. No makeup. No new shoes. Her usual navy blouse pressed. Hair tied back. He arrived alone, wearing a coat too thin for the season and a quiet expression. She met him in the entrance corridor, flanked by safety posters and fingerprint check-ins. He smiled when he saw her, but didn't reach for her hand. Hello? He said. She nodded. Welcome back. They walked the floor together. No fanfare. No entourage. Workers glanced up as they passed, whispering behind bolt carts and textile bins. But no one approached. He stopped once, watching the new sorting conveyor she had installed. You did all this? Yes. He nodded. It's cleaner. Quieter. More efficient. He looked at her. You always were. They paused near the edge of the warehouse, where new uniforms hung in neat rows, blue instead of the old gray. A symbolic change she hadn't explained to anyone. I read your latest production summary, he said. You turned this place into something better. Her voice was calm. Without you. He met her eyes. But not against me. Silence fell again. Then, softly, why didn't you write back? She studied him for a long moment. Because you were the first person who didn't ask me to be smaller. And I wasn't ready for how that made me feel. And now? I still don't know. He nodded. I've missed you, he said. She looked down. That's the hardest part. So have I. He stayed longer than expected. Daniel didn't schedule board meetings or press visits. He didn't appear on the factory website or send company-wide announcements. He came to the plant 3 times in the week after their first meeting. Always unannounced, always quiet. Sometimes he simply walked the perimeter, hands in his coat pockets, stopping to observe how fabric moved from one end of the line to the other. Sometimes he brought coffee. Once he left it on her desk with no note. She drank it anyway. They rarely spoke alone. She didn't invite him into her office, and he didn't ask. He stood with the workers during briefings, took lunch in the break room with the logistics team. He let people talk to him like he was just another man. But she knew better. So did everyone else. Whispers followed them. Not unkind, but persistent. And though he hadn't said anything more since that first afternoon, the space between them was thick with all the words they hadn't spoken. Friday evening, after the floor had gone quiet and the lights above the workstations had dimmed to their night mode haze, she found him outside by the parking lot. The sky was dim, early spring mist settling on the cars. "You wait for me?" she asked. He turned slowly. "I never left." She crossed her arms against the cold. "Why are you really here, Daniel?" He was quiet for a long moment, then said, "Because every other place I go feels hollow now. And this place, your presence, reminds me what it feels like to belong somewhere." She looked down at the damp asphalt. "You say that like it's romantic." "It's not," he said. "It's inconvenient. Messy. Maybe even a mistake." "Then stop." "I can't." She looked up at him then, anger blooming not from hatred but fear. "You left, Daniel. You disappeared when I needed to know what we were." He didn't defend himself. Just nodded, like he'd rehearsed that guilt. "I didn't know what to offer you," he said. "I still don't." "What do you want from me?" she asked. "To stay." The wind pushed between them, and in it, something shifted. Her jaw tightened. "You want to stay?" she repeated. "Here. With me." He stepped forward cautiously. "Only if you want me to." "I don't know what I want," she whispered. He reached out, then stopped, letting his hand hover between them, empty. "I'll wait," he said. "For as long as it takes." That night she sat at her kitchen table long after midnight. Her notebook lay open in front of her. "He still doesn't ask me to shrink. And maybe that's why it hurts more." She closed the book without signing her name. By Monday, he was gone again. No goodbye. Just a memo from his assistant. "Mr. Varanin has resumed international expansion work. Further communication can be directed through corporate channels." And a note in her inbox, unsigned, no subject line. "You were never just a chapter. You are the story." She stared at it for a long time. Then she pressed delete. Not because she didn't believe it, but because it scared her how much she did. Spring came late to the city that year, clinging to cold mornings and gray skies that refused to let go. Inside the factory, though, the rhythms had settled into something strangely close to harmony. Yulia's management had stabilized operations. Efficiency had risen again. Even turnover had slowed to a trickle. It wasn't perfect, no place was, but the old factory had taken on something she'd never thought it could: pride. People started saying "our factory." Her name carried weight now. Not whispered anymore, but spoken with respect. Sometimes reverence. And Yulia began to realize something strange: power, when hard-earned, wasn't intoxicating. It was exhausting. Every decision rested on her shoulders. Every complaint passed through her desk. Every failure, no matter how small, wore her name. And beneath it all, his absence still carved space in her days. Quiet reminders. An untouched coffee mug in her cabinet. A folded note she hadn't thrown away. "You are the story." But stories needed endings. One Friday afternoon, a man named Leonid, from the International Division, arrived to conduct an audit. Not unexpected, but inconvenient. He wore the smoothness of someone too comfortable in boardrooms and spoke in polite threats masked as compliments. "This plant," he said over tea in her office, "is performing well above expectations." Which, frankly, is both impressive and suspicious. "Suspicious?" Yulia asked, raising an eyebrow. He smiled as if she were playing a game. "Success at this scale usually comes with cost-cutting. Favoritism. Inflated reports. Her tone remained even. Not here. Of course. He sipped his tea, watching her. Mr. Varanen speaks very highly of you. She said nothing. He's invested. Personally, it seems. Still nothing. Leonid leaned forward, lowering his voice. You should be careful, Ms. Morozova. When powerful men leave, they don't always take the rumors with them. That night Yulia couldn't sleep. Not because the insinuation hurt, she'd weathered worse, but because part of her feared how easily her reputation could unravel. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how clean the data, people always looked for shortcuts to explain a woman's success. Especially if a man had once looked at her the way Daniel had. On Sunday, she visited her mother for the first time in weeks. They sat in silence, sipping broth in the small apartment where Yulia had grown up. Her mother's illness had plateaued, neither improving nor worsening, but it had carved her down to something quieter. More fragile. You look tired, her mother said gently. Yulia managed a smile. It's part of the job. You always worked hard. Yulia set down her spoon. Did I make the right choice, Mama? Taking the promotion. Staying. Becoming who I am now. Her mother studied her face for a long moment. You stopped being invisible, she said finally. That always comes at a cost. The only question is if it's worth it to be seen. The next day, a letter arrived. Not from Daniel. From the Varanen Group's executive committee. A formal offer. They wanted Yulia to take over operations for 3 regional plants. A new title. More control. Higher salary. A corner office in the city headquarters. And an unspoken understanding, she would leave this factory behind. Leave the floor she once cleaned. The machines she once operated. The people who now trusted her. It was a promotion in every measurable way. Except one. It meant giving up the life she had built by hand. That evening, she went back to the factory after hours. Alone. The lights were off, the machines still. The silence felt like memory. She walked the floor slowly, tracing the same paths she had once followed as a new worker. She stopped by her old station, where her initials were still scratched faintly into the metal guard rail. No one had ever cleaned them off. She ran her fingers over them. And for the first time in years she cried. Not out of sadness, but because she finally understood what she had become. And what she was about to lose. The next morning, she wrote 2 letters. The first was addressed to the Varanen Group. She thanked them for the offer. She declined it. Impact doesn't require a skyline view, she wrote. Sometimes it lives where the machines still run, and the dust still settles. The second was harder. Dear Daniel, you once told me I was the story. But I've realized something since then. The story doesn't end when someone important leaves. It ends when someone strong forgets why they started. I haven't forgotten. Don't come back for me. Not unless you're ready to stay for this. For all of it. The noise. The dirt. The long days. The factory. Me. Yulia. She didn't mail it. But she didn't tear it up either. She left it on her desk. And got back to work. It had been 6 weeks since she'd written the letter she never sent. She didn't hear from Daniel. Not directly. But she felt the ripple of his movements in the background, like a current running under the surface of calm waters. He was in Switzerland, they said. Then Istanbul. Then Madrid. Auditing deals, shaking hands, expanding markets. He was building empires again. And she was still in the factory. The workers called her director now. Not with sarcasm, but with something close to affection. The break room had improved. The shift rotations ran smoother. There was less yelling, more trust. She knew their birthdays, their children's names, the illnesses they didn't always disclose. She didn't want to run 3 plants. She wanted to run this one, perfectly. That was her empire. It was a rainy Tuesday when he returned. No announcement, no escort, no warning. He simply walked into the factory at noon in a soaked coat and muddy boots. The front desk didn't recognize him at first. Neither did the floor workers. But she did. She saw him from her office window as he passed row 2, nodding to the older machinists, trailing his hand lightly along the steel guardrail where her initials were still etched. She didn't go down to meet him. Not yet. She waited. When he finally knocked on her door, she let him stand there a few seconds longer than necessary. Then she opened it. He looked different. Leaner. More tired. But still Daniel. She didn't ask why he was here. He didn't ask to come in. Have you changed your mind? He asked. She shook her head. No. A pause. Then a quiet smile touched his lips. Neither have I. She stepped aside. They didn't speak about the past. Not at first. He sat across from her desk, his coat still damp, eyes scanning the room as though memorizing the space she'd made hers. I read your report on the material switch, he said. Smart. Cost neutral, better yield. Did you come to talk about fabric? No, he said. I came to talk about permanence. She stared. I've spent years building things meant to last. Buildings. Companies. Brands. But I kept moving, always. One more deal. One more continent. One more next thing. He leaned forward. I think I was afraid that if I stayed still, I'd have to ask if I'd built anything that truly mattered. She said nothing. I read your letter, he added, voice quieter now. Your assistant sent me a scanned copy by accident, thinking it was a report. Yulia felt her chest tighten. I never meant to. I know, he said. That's what made it real. Silence. Then, I came back because I'm ready to stay. She looked at him for a long time. And if I say no? He nodded slowly. Then I'll leave. And you won't hear from me again. And if I say yes? Then I become the man who walks beside you. Not in front. Not above. Beside. The factory rumbled beneath them, machines roaring back to life after the lunch bell. Outside her office window, she saw Alexei guiding a new trainee, pointing to the emergency stop switch with the same urgency she once used to save him. I don't want to be rescued, she said. I know. I don't need a fairy tale. I never wanted to write one. They were quiet again. Finally she stood. Walked around the desk. Stopped in front of him. And for the first time since the day she pulled a man out from under falling fabric, Yulia reached out. Not to save. But to hold. I don't need you, she whispered. But I want you. He took her hand. I'm staying. The months that followed were quiet, not in sound, but in conflict. No scandals erupted. No sweeping declarations were made. Daniel didn't move into her apartment, or buy out her factory. He didn't hover over her desk or ask her to change her life. He simply stayed. At first, the workers watched him like an anomaly, still unsure if this man with expensive shoes and callous pride was truly here for the long haul. But as days passed, he fell into a rhythm. Some mornings he arrived with deliveries, supplies the plant had needed but never requested. Other days he stood by the floor mechanic, listening more than speaking. Yulia never named what they were. Not at first. She still signed forms as Director Morozova. Still took meetings alone. But something in her steadiness softened. She smiled more often. Laughed sometimes, when no one expected her to. And Daniel, he didn't chase headlines anymore. His name started disappearing from corporate articles, while new appointments took his place in the Varanin Group's global initiatives. He had stepped back. Willingly. She asked him once if he missed it. He replied, sometimes. But what I've built here matters more. She knew he didn't mean the factory. One weekend, the two of them drove out of the city. It was a quiet village by the river, where textile dye once ran into the water in streaks of color long since faded. They parked near an abandoned mill, and he walked her through the bones of it, his grandfather's first factory. They called it useless, he said, looking at the rusted beams. Too small. Too old. Too messy. But he built it with borrowed tools and kept it running with hope. Yulia looked at him. And you think this is your inheritance? He shook his head. No, he said. You are. She didn't cry. Not then. But that night, when she opened the old notebook she kept by her bed, she wrote a final entry. I've spent years trying to be strong because I thought love meant sacrifice. That to let someone close was to risk being reduced, rewritten, claimed. But real love doesn't rewrite you. It reads you. And he reads me. Page by page. He knows my story began long before he walked in. And he's willing to earn a place in its future. I've decided to give him one. The wedding was small. Not the kind the tabloids would ever report on. Held in a glass room above the factory floor, where bolts of finished cloth hung along the windows and machines paused respectfully for the weekend. Alexei brought the flowers. Anya cried through the vows. Even Victor, the man who once told her she was a placeholder, stood in the back and clapped, awkwardly, but sincerely. She wore no veil. He wore no tie. When asked why the factory, she simply said, "Because this is where I became myself." And no ballroom could ever honor that more. Years later, a new plaque was mounted above the main floor. Morozova Textiles. EST 2024. Founded on labor. Led with vision. Tourists sometimes asked about the name. And Daniel, now Mr. Morozov only when joking, would tell them the truth. This wasn't my factory. It was hers. And she? She'd smile, standing beside him, fingers interlaced with the man who didn't save her life. Only gave her the space to live it fully. Together,